Hello there. Come on in, settle down. Don't worry about the draft, it's just the old house breathing. Tonight, we're going to drift back to a time filled with shadows and whispers, a time when the veil between worlds felt, well, rather thin. A time when the living weren't quite ready to let go of the dead, and the dead, it seemed, weren't quite done with the living. We're pulling back the heavy velvet curtains on the Victorian Era, a period we often remember for its stiff collars, even stiffer social etiquette, and a general air of, well, let's call it repressed enthusiasm. But beneath that polished, tightly laced surface, there was a deep, swirling undercurrent of fascination with the unseen, the uncanny, and the downright spectral. We're going to talk about why an entire generation, so famously devoted to progress, industry, and the cold, hard facts of science, became utterly and completely obsessed with talking to ghosts. So, find a comfortable spot. Let the fire warm your feet and the shadows dance on the ceiling. We're not here to be frightened. We're here to understand. We're going to dim the gas lamps, join hands around the table, and listen for the faint, far-off rappings from the past. This is the story of the Victorian seance, of the quiet, desperate hope that flickered in the gloom of 1,000 darkened parlors. Chapter 1. The Ever-Present Guest. Before we can even begin to comprehend the Victorian seance, before we dim the lights and listen for the spirits, we must first understand the landscape in which this obsession took root, and that landscape was dominated by a single, looming, ever-present figure: death itself. For us, in our modern world, death is an event that is, for the most part, medicalized and sanitized. It happens in hospitals behind closed doors, managed by professionals. It is something we are shielded from. For the Victorians, death was not an event, it was an atmosphere. It was a constant, intimate, and often unpredictable houseguest who might arrive at any moment, without so much as a calling card. Imagine, if you can, the sounds and smells of a Victorian city like London. The air is thick with the smoke of 1,000,000 coal fires, a yellow-brown fog that catches in the back of your throat. This pervasive smog, romanticized in detective stories, was a genuine menace, contributing to respiratory illnesses that could carry off the weak and the elderly with terrifying speed. Now, add to that the state of sanitation. The River Thames, the city's main artery, was for much of the century a vast, open sewer. Cholera, a disease that could reduce a healthy person to a withered husk in a matter of hours, would sweep through neighborhoods in devastating epidemics, its origins a mystery until the pioneering work of Dr. John Snow. Typhoid, diphtheria, smallpox, and scarlet fever were the bogeymen of the nursery, illnesses that could snatch a child from its bed in a matter of days. And then there was the great specter of consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. This was a slow, creeping death, a disease that hollowed a person out from the inside, giving them a tragically romantic, pale-faced beauty before its final, inevitable claim. It was so common that it became a feature of the era's literature and art, the beautiful, dying heroine, coughing delicately into a lace handkerchief. But the reality was anything but romantic. It was a wasting disease that filled homes with the sounds of labored breathing and the quiet dread of a battle already lost. Nowhere was this presence of death more keenly felt than in the loss of children. Infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high. It was not at all uncommon for a family to have 5, 6, or even 10 children, only to see half of them perish before reaching the age of 5. Every family, from the poorest laborer in an East End slum to the wealthiest aristocrat in a Belgravia mansion, knew this particular heartbreak. They lived with the ghosts of the children they had lost, the empty crib, the toys left untouched, the deafening silence in a once noisy nursery. This constant, searing grief became a foundational part of the Victorian emotional experience. It wasn't a question of if you would lose someone you loved dearly, but when and how many. This constant proximity to death meant that the Victorians were not afraid to look it in the face. They were connoisseurs of its rituals. The body of the deceased would often remain in the home, laid out in the parlor for several days before the funeral. Family members would sit with their dead, keeping a vigil, talking to them, touching their cold hands. It was a final, intimate act of farewell. This practice, so alien to us, forged a powerful, tangible connection to the physical reality of death. It wasn't an abstract concept. It was the still, silent form of your husband, your sister, your child, lying in the best room of the house, surrounded by flowers meant to mask a scent that was all too familiar. In this world, a world so thoroughly saturated with the presence of the departed, the idea of the dead not being truly gone, of them lingering just beyond our sight, wasn't a leap of fantasy. It was a logical, almost comforting extension of everyday reality. Chapter 2. The Art of Saying Goodbye. Living so closely with death, the Victorians did what any highly organized, socially conscious society would do. They turned grieving into an elaborate and rigorously policed art form. Mourning wasn't just a personal feeling. It was a public duty, a complex performance with its own script, costumes, and a timetable that could stretch on for years. To fail in this performance was not just a sign of disrespect to the dead. It was a grave social embarrassment, a black mark against one's character and standing in the community. It was, in its own way, a full-time occupation, especially for women. When a death occurred in a middle or upper class household, the entire home was immediately transformed into a theater of grief. The first act was to stop the clocks at the moment of passing, a poignant symbol of time ending for the deceased. Mirrors were draped in black or white cloth, a tradition rooted in an old superstition that the soul of the departed could become trapped in the reflection. Straw was laid down on the street outside the house to muffle the sound of carriage wheels and horses' hooves, creating a bubble of respectful quiet around the grieving family. Even the family's stationery was changed. For months, all correspondence would be written on paper with thick black borders, the width of the border shrinking incrementally as the mourning period progressed. The centerpiece of this entire ritual, however, was the clothing. Victorian mourning attire was a universe of complex rules and subtle signals. For a widow, the process was at its most intense. She would immediately enter full mourning, a period lasting a year and a day. Her entire wardrobe would consist of dresses made from dull, non-reflective black fabrics, most famously black crepe, a stiff, scratchy, and deeply uncomfortable material whose very texture seemed to embody the harshness of grief. A widow in full mourning was a walking silhouette of sorrow, from her black bonnet and heavy veil to her black gloves, jet jewelry, and even black-edged handkerchiefs. After the first year, she might progress to second mourning, where the oppressive crepe could be set aside for other black fabrics like silk or wool. A few subtle trimmings of dark purple or gray might be permitted. Finally, after perhaps 2 years or more, she could enter half-mourning, where muted shades of gray, lavender, and mauve were allowed back into her wardrobe. For a man, the rules were far less demanding. A simple black suit and a black armband or hatband would suffice. The burden of performing the family's grief fell, as so many burdens did, squarely on the shoulders of its women. This wasn't just about fashion. It was about creating a visible, tangible barrier between the bereaved and the rest of society. A woman in a mourning veil was a signal to the world. Do not approach me with frivolity. Do not expect me to smile or engage in idle chatter. I am in a sacred space of sorrow, but it was also isolating. It trapped women in their grief, making it their primary public identity for years on end. To keep the memory of the lost one alive, they created beautiful, intricate objects known as memento mori. The most personal of these was hair jewelry. Locks of the deceased's hair would be painstakingly woven and braided into elaborate patterns, then encased in lockets, brooches, or rings. It was a way of keeping a physical part of the person you loved literally next to your heart. And then there was post-mortem photography, a practice that seems morbid to us but was, for them, a final, desperate attempt to capture the image of a loved one, especially a child, before they were consigned to the earth. Families would pose with their dead, arranging them in peaceful, slumber-like poses. These weren't ghoulish trophies. They were the most precious, heartbreaking of family portraits. This deep, all-consuming culture of remembrance, this refusal to let go, created a profound psychological need. If you were already wearing your dead husband's hair in a brooch, is it truly so strange to then wish you could also hear his voice? The Victorians weren't just ready to talk to the dead. Their entire culture of mourning was a one-sided conversation, just waiting for a reply. Chapter 3. A World Primed for Whispers. Long before 2 teenage girls in upstate New York heard a series of mysterious knocks, the intellectual and spiritual ground in both America and Europe was already being prepared for something like spiritualism. The movement didn't erupt out of nowhere. It was the culmination of several streams of unconventional thought that had been bubbling just beneath the surface of mainstream society for decades. The Victorian parlor was already haunted by a few strange philosophical ghosts before the spirits of the dead decided to make a formal appearance. One of the most significant of these precursors was the work of Emanuel Swedenborg, an 18th-century Swedish scientist, philosopher, and theologian. Swedenborg was a brilliant and respected man of science who, in his late 50s, had a profound spiritual crisis that led him to believe he could freely visit heaven and hell and converse with angels, demons, and spirits. He wrote voluminous, detailed accounts of his travels in the afterlife, describing a spirit world that was not a distant, abstract realm, but a solid, tangible reality, a direct continuation of our earthly existence. For Swedenborg, the veil between worlds was permeable, and communication was not only possible but natural. His writings, though complex and esoteric, gained a dedicated following, and Swedenborgian churches were established, promoting the idea that the spiritual and material worlds were deeply interconnected. This laid a crucial piece of philosophical groundwork, the idea that the afterlife was a place you could, in theory, get a message from. Then there was mesmerism, the brainchild of the 18th century German doctor Franz Mesmer. Mesmer theorized the existence of an invisible natural force, which he called animal magnetism, that flowed through all living things. He believed that illnesses were caused by blockages in this flow, and that a mesmerist could manipulate this energy, often using magnets or simply their hands to cure patients. The most dramatic part of his practice was the mesmeric trance, a sleep-like state into which he could place his subjects. While in this trance, subjects often exhibited strange abilities. They might become insensitive to pain, or more curiously, display clairvoyant powers, describing events happening miles away or seemingly reading the thoughts of others. Though mainstream science largely dismissed Mesmer's theories, mesmerism became a wildly popular phenomenon, a mixture of medical treatment, scientific demonstration, and parlor entertainment. Traveling mesmerists would put on shows, hypnotizing volunteers from the audience to the astonishment of the crowds. For our story, the key takeaway from mesmerism was the trance state. It popularized the idea that an individual could enter an altered state of consciousness that made them receptive to unseen forces and information. The mesmerized subject, or sensitive, was the direct forerunner of the spiritualist medium. They were the human instrument, the living receiver through which the invisible world could be accessed. These ideas, combined with other movements like Fourierism and Shakerism, which often involved their own forms of spiritual communication and trance states, created a cultural atmosphere ripe with possibility. The world was already buzzing with invisible forces, the unseen energy of animal magnetism, the unheard whispers from Swedenborg's spirit realm. People were becoming accustomed to the idea that there was more to reality than met the eye, and that certain sensitive individuals could act as bridges to this hidden world. The stage was set, the audience was primed with a mixture of scientific curiosity, philosophical inquiry, and a deep-seated human need for connection. All that was needed was a signal, a clear, unmistakable sign that the spirits were not just a theological concept, but were ready and waiting to make contact. That signal was about to come, not from a philosopher's treatise or a scientist's laboratory, but from the thin wooden walls of a humble American farmhouse. Chapter 4. The Knock Heard, Round the World. Our story now travels across the Atlantic, away from the foggy, crowded streets of London, to a small, unassuming wooden house in the rural hamlet of Hydesville, New York. It is a place of no particular importance, a place that history would have completely forgotten were it not for the strange events that began to unfold there in the winter of 1847. This was the home of the Fox family. A tenant farmer named John, his wife Margaret, and their two youngest daughters, 14-year-old Margaretta, known as Maggie, and 11-year-old Catherine, or Kate. It was through these two young girls that the silent, waiting world of the spirits would finally find a voice that was as simple and as startling as a knock in the night. The family had been living in the house for only a few months when the noises started. At first, they were easy enough to dismiss. The creaks and groans of an old house settling, the tapping of a loose shutter in the wind. But as the weeks went on, the sounds became more distinct, more insistent. They heard rappings on the walls, on the floor, on the very headboards of their beds. They heard the heavy tread of footsteps in empty rooms, and the sound of furniture being dragged across the floorboards overhead. It was unnerving, a nightly disturbance that frayed their nerves and filled the little house with a palpable sense of tension. The climax arrived on the evening of March 31st, 1848. The rappings were louder and more persistent than ever before. The family had been trying to sleep, but the constant rhythmic knocking made it impossible. Finally, according to the legend that has been told and retold ever since, young Kate decided to challenge the invisible presence. In a moment of childish audacity, she called out into the darkness, "Mr. Splitfoot, do as I do." She clapped her hands several times. From the wall, an identical number of raps answered back. A stunned silence filled the room. The game had changed. This wasn't just noise anymore, it was a response. Her older sister, Maggie, joined in, clapping her hands and snapping her fingers, and each time the invisible rapper matched her, beat for beat. Their mother, Margaret, her initial terror giving way to a bewildered curiosity, decided to intervene. She began to ask questions that could be answered with a number. "How many children have I had?" 7 raps echoed in the room. This was correct, including a child who had died in infancy. A chill must have prickled her skin. She continued, asking the ages of her children. Each question was answered with a precise number of knocks. A neighbor was called in to witness the phenomenon. He, too, began asking questions about his own life, his own family. And the raps continued to answer correctly, astonishingly. Through a code they devised, 1 rap for yes, 2 for no, a more complex conversation began. They asked the entity to identify itself. The raps slowly spelled out a story. It was the spirit of a peddler, a man named Charles B. Rosna, who claimed he had been murdered in that very house 5 years earlier for the $500 he was carrying, his body buried in the cellar. This was no longer just a strange phenomenon. It was a murder confession from beyond the grave. News of the Hydesville rappings spread through the small community with the speed of gossip. The Fox family's little house became a local attraction. People came from all over the county to sit in the parlor, to ask their own questions of the rapping spirit, and to leave convinced that they had witnessed a miracle. The 2 young girls, Kate and Maggie, were at the center of it all, the unlikely prophets of a new revelation. They seemed to be the conduits, the human batteries that enabled the spirits to communicate. Their older sister, Leah Fish, who lived in the nearby city of Rochester, soon heard of the events. A shrewd, practical, and ambitious woman, she immediately saw the profound implications, and perhaps the commercial potential, of her sister's strange new talent. She took them under her wing, moving them to Rochester and organizing public demonstrations. The phenomenon of the rapping girls from Hydesville was about to go on tour. The knock that had started in a single dark bedroom was about to become a sound heard around the world, signaling the dawn of a new age of belief. Chapter 5. Crossing the Pond. The strange new gospel of spiritualism, born in the humble, knocking rooms of the Fox household, was not destined to remain an American curiosity. Like any sensational idea in the 19th century, it soon boarded a steamship and made the journey across the Atlantic. When the news of spirit communication arrived in Great Britain in the early 1850s, it found a nation perfectly, almost poetically, prepared to receive it. The British, with their deep-seated love of ghost stories, their culture steeped in the Gothic and the mysterious, and their drawing rooms already filled with the melancholy shadows of recent loss, were fertile ground. The first true missionary of the movement to arrive in London was Mrs. Maria B. Hayden, an American medium who traveled to England in 1852 with her husband and a letter of introduction to a prominent social reformer. Hayden was not a flamboyant showwoman. She was a respectable, rather plain-looking figure, which in many ways added to her credibility. She didn't put on a theatrical performance. She simply sat with her clients in a quiet room and, it was said, summoned the spirits, who would communicate through the now familiar rappings and by tipping the table. Her arrival caused an immediate sensation, dividing the intellectual circles of London. She held séances for a guinea a person, a very handsome sum at the time, and the drawing rooms of the curious and the well-to-do were soon buzzing with talk of her abilities. Famous scientists, writers, and politicians flocked to her sessions. Some came away utterly convinced, their skepticism shattered by the uncanny accuracy of the messages they received. Robert Owen, the famous utopian socialist, became a fervent convert in his old age after Hayden apparently channeled the spirit of his long-dead father. Others left her presence convinced she was a clever fraud, though they were often at a loss to explain exactly how she did it. The press had a field day. Newspapers, like the Times, treated the subject with scornful skepticism, while other publications, particularly the new penny press that catered to a mass audience, covered the spirit-rapping phenomenon with breathless excitement. The popular magazine, Household Words, edited by none other than Charles Dickens, took a typically robust and cynical view. Dickens himself attended a séance and declared it a dreary and pathetic imposture, later writing a scathing article that ridiculed the entire affair. He found the spirits to be dreadfully uninspired, with nothing interesting to say, remarking on their paltry messages and silly revelations. Despite the mockery from established figures like Dickens, the idea took hold of the public imagination. The table-turning craze swept the country. It seemed as though in every parlor, from Brighton to Edinburgh, people were gathering around their mahogany tables, placing their hands upon them, and waiting in hopeful anticipation for a sign. It became a kind of national pastime, a parlor game with the most profound of stakes. For every person who saw it as a bit of spooky fun, there was another who saw it as a sacred rite, a genuine experiment in contacting the next world. The early British mediums began to emerge, inspired by Hayden's success. One of the most notable was Daniel Douglas Home, pronounced Hume, a Scottish-born medium of extraordinary charisma and talent. Home's phenomena were far more dramatic than simple table-tipping. He was famous for levitating, for handling hot coals without being burned, and for producing disembodied spirit hands that would float through the room and touch the sitters. Crucially, Home often performed his séances in good light, and he was never, in a long and storied career, definitively exposed as a fraud, a fact that baffled his critics and thrilled his supporters. He captivated high society, performing for royalty across Europe, including Napoleon III in France and the Tsar of Russia. With the arrival of figures like Hayden and Home, spiritualism established a firm foothold in its ancestral home. The American seed had been planted in British soil, and it was beginning to grow into something uniquely British, a movement that combined American showmanship with a deep Victorian earnestness, a profound sense of melancholy, and an almost scientific passion for investigation. The conversation with the dead had officially crossed the pond. Chapter 6. The Celestial Telegraph. You might imagine that an age so defined by its scientific and industrial progress, an age of steam, steel, and ruthless logic, would have immediately dismissed the claims of spiritualism as pre-scientific nonsense. And while many did, a surprising number of the era's most forward-thinking and educated minds saw something entirely different. To them, spiritualism wasn't a throwback to a superstitious past. It was a glimpse into a scientific future. It wasn't magic. It was an exploration of natural laws that were not yet fully understood. And the key to this perspective lay in the very technologies that were transforming their world. Consider the electric telegraph. Patented in the 1830s and 40s, it was, for the average person, a piece of pure, unadulterated wizardry. An operator could tap a small key in London, and through an invisible force called electricity, flowing along miles and miles of wire, a message would be spelled out, almost instantaneously, in a station in Bristol or Paris, or by the 1860s even New York. It was communication stripped of its physical body, a disembodied message traveling at impossible speeds. If this was possible, if human thought could be converted into an invisible energy and sent across an ocean, was it truly so unthinkable that the thoughts of a departed soul could be sent across the much shorter, much thinner veil of death? This analogy became the central, most powerful argument for the scientific plausibility of spiritualism. Believers didn't speak of summoning spirits, they spoke of receiving transmissions. The medium was not a witch or a sorcerer. She was a sensitive instrument, a human telegraph receiver, finely tuned to pick up the subtle vibrations from the spirit world. The spirits themselves were not wispy phantoms. They were beings operating on a different frequency, using a form of etheric energy or odic force to power their communications. This was the celestial telegraph, and its proponents borrowed the language of physics and engineering to make their case. This scientific framing was incredibly appealing to a generation that venerated progress. It allowed a person to hold on to a belief in the soul and the afterlife without feeling as though they were rejecting the modern world. In fact, it positioned them at the cutting edge as explorers of a new frontier of human knowledge. The séance was not a ritual. It was an experiment. The parlor was not a chamber of horrors. It was a laboratory. They were simply investigating phenomena, gathering data, and applying the scientific method to the ultimate question of human existence. This is why the movement attracted not just the grieving and the gullible, but also a startling number of eminent scientists. Sir William Crookes, one of the most respected chemists and physicists of his day, the discoverer of the element thallium and the inventor of the Crookes tube, which was essential for the later discovery of X-rays, became a dedicated and serious investigator of spiritualist phenomena. He conducted a series of famous experiments with the medium Florence Cook, hoping to prove or disprove her ability to materialize a full-form spirit named Katie King. To the astonishment of his colleagues, Crookes came away convinced of the genuineness of the phenomena. Alfred Russel Wallace, the naturalist who independently co-developed the theory of evolution by natural selection with Charles Darwin, was another passionate advocate. For Wallace, evolution explained the material world, but spiritualism proved the existence of the spiritual world that lay beyond it. These men weren't fools. They were brilliant, rigorous thinkers who saw in spiritualism a logical extension of the world they were already exploring. The universe, they knew, was filled with invisible forces: gravity, magnetism, electricity. Why was it so absurd to think there might be one more? The camera could capture an image on a chemical plate, a ghost of a moment in time. The phonograph could capture a voice, a ghost of a sound. In a world of such technological marvels, the idea of capturing a message from the ghost of a person seemed, to many, like the next logical step. Chapter 7. The Crisis of Faith. While the marvels of science provided a powerful new language for talking about the supernatural, another great intellectual current of the age was inadvertently driving people towards the seance table, the slow, painful erosion of traditional religious faith. The Victorian era was, on the surface, a period of profound and public piety. Church-going was a cornerstone of respectability, and the language of the Bible permeated every aspect of public and private life. But beneath this devout surface, the very foundations of Christian belief were being shaken by a series of intellectual earthquakes. For centuries, the Bible had been viewed by most as the literal, unshakable Word of God. It was a history book, a scientific text, and a moral guide all in one. But in the 19th century, this certainty began to crumble. A new school of thought from Germany, known as higher criticism, began to analyze the Bible not as a divine text, but as a historical one, written by multiple human authors over many centuries. This approach revealed inconsistencies and contradictions, suggesting that the Holy Book was perhaps not so inerrant after all. At the same time, the new science of geology was unearthing a story of the earth that was radically different from the one told in the book of Genesis. Geologists like Charles Lyell demonstrated that the planet was not a few thousand years old, but millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of years old. They showed that its mountains and valleys had been formed not by a single cataclysmic flood, but by slow, gradual processes of erosion and uplift over immense spans of time. The fossil record told a similar story of strange, extinct creatures and a world that existed long before the arrival of humankind. The biblical account of a 7-day creation was, for anyone who took the new science seriously, becoming impossible to believe in a literal sense. The final, decisive blow came in 1859 with the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. The theory of evolution by natural selection provided a powerful, elegant, and entirely materialist explanation for the diversity of life on Earth. It suggested that humanity was not the special, divine creation of God, set apart from and above the animal kingdom, but was rather the product of the same blind, natural processes as every other living thing. We were not fallen angels, we were risen apes. The implications were terrifying for many. If there was no divine creator, what was the source of morality? If the soul was not breathed into us by God, did it even exist at all? This created a profound spiritual crisis for a generation raised on absolute faith. For many, the old certainties were gone, replaced by a cold, empty, mechanical universe. The comfort of a guaranteed afterlife in heaven once a bedrock of their culture, now seemed like a comforting fairy tale. This is the void into which spiritualism stepped. It arrived at the perfect historical moment, offering a solution to the crisis it had helped to create. It told people, you don't have to take the existence of the soul on faith anymore. You don't need ancient texts or dogmatic priests. We can prove it to you. Spiritualism presented itself as an empirical religion. Its central claim, that the human personality survives the death of the body, was, it argued, a testable hypothesis. The proof could be found not in a book, but in the laboratory of the séance room. You could come and see for yourself. You could hear the voices of the departed, receive messages containing information that the medium could not possibly have known, and even, on occasion, see and touch the materialized forms of your loved ones. For those whose faith had been shattered by Darwin and the geologists, this was an irresistible offer. It promised to reconcile the head and the heart, to provide a belief system that was both spiritually satisfying and compatible with a scientific worldview. It offered tangible, audible, physical evidence for the one thing they most desperately needed to believe, that death was not the end. Chapter 8. The Theater of the Parlor. Let us now push open the heavy oak door and slip quietly into the heart of the movement itself, the Victorian séance. Let's find a seat in the corner, become part of the shadows, and watch the strange and solemn theater unfold. The setting is almost always the same. The parlor, the drawing room, the very heart of the respectable middle-class home. This is a crucial detail. The séance wasn't a ritual conducted in a drafty church or a remote, spooky ruin. It took place amidst the familiar comforts of domestic life. The family piano, the embroidered cushions, the mantelpiece crowded with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. This domesticity was key to its power, grounding the supernatural in the everyday. The evening usually begins after dinner. The gas lamps, with their soft, hissing hum, are turned down low, until the room is bathed in a deep, soupy twilight. Sometimes only a few candles are used, their flames dancing and throwing long, distorted shadows across the patterned wallpaper. The curtains are drawn tight, not just for privacy, but to create a sealed, sacred space, insulated from the noisy, skeptical world outside. The low light, the participants were told, was a necessity. The spirits were delicate beings, and their ethereal manifestations could be destroyed by a harsh glare. Of course, it also provided excellent cover for any earthly trickery, but in the moment, it served to heighten every sense. Your eyes strain to see, your ears are pricked for the slightest sound. The atmosphere is thick with anticipation. The sitters, usually no more than a dozen, arrange themselves around a large, heavy table, often made of mahogany or oak. They are a mixed group. There is the grieving widow, her face pale beneath her black mourning bonnet, here in the desperate hope of a final word from her husband. There is the curious intellectual, a man with a notebook in his pocket, eager to observe the phenomena with a scientific eye. There are the young couple, holding hands tightly, perhaps for the thrill of it all. And at the head of the table sits the medium, the star of the show. The séance often begins with a prayer or the singing of a hymn, perhaps "Nearer, my God, to Thee." This serves to unify the group and to create a solemn, reverent mood. This is not a game, the hymn implies. This is a spiritual undertaking. Then comes the instruction to join hands. The circle is formed. The sitters are told that this creates a circuit of human energy, a battery of vitality that the spirits can draw upon to make their presence known. The physical contact, the warmth of your neighbor's hand, also enhances the sense of shared experience. You are all in this together, a small island of belief in the dark. The medium then begins the process of entering a trance. This is the first piece of high drama. Her breathing might become deep and ragged. Her head might loll back, her eyes roll up into their sockets. She might shudder or tremble, as if possessed by a powerful current. Sometimes her voice will change, becoming deeper or higher, or adopting a strange accent. This is the arrival of her spirit guide, a spiritual master of ceremonies, often a supposedly ancient Egyptian, a Native American chief, or a whimsical child spirit who will act as an intermediary for the evening. And then there is silence. A deep, expectant hush falls over the room. The only sound is the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, if it hasn't been stopped, and the soft breathing of the people around you. They wait. It might be minutes, it might be half an hour. The tension builds. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind in the chimney sounds like a signal. And then it comes. A soft, clear tap from the underside of the table. A gasp goes around the circle. Another tap, louder this time. The performance has begun. The celestial telegraph is open for business, and the messages, for better or for worse, are about to start coming through. Chapter 9. The Tools of Contact. As the spiritualist movement evolved from a fringe curiosity into a mainstream obsession, the methods of communication became more varied and, in their own way, more inventive. The simple, percussive language of the spirit rap, while still a staple, was soon supplemented by a whole host of new techniques and devices designed to provide a clearer, more direct, and often more dramatic line to the other side. The Victorian parlor, once a place for tea and polite conversation, was transformed into a workshop for supernatural engineering, filled with strange and wonderful tools for talking to the dead. One of the most popular and accessible of these tools was the planchette, which means little plank in French. This was a small, heart-shaped or triangular piece of wood, set on two little caster wheels and with a hole in its point to hold a pencil. Person, or a small group of people, would rest their fingertips lightly on its surface and place it on a large sheet of paper. After a period of quiet concentration, the planchette would begin to twitch and then glide across the paper. The pencil tracing out words, names, and messages, seemingly of its own accord. This was automatic writing, and it was thrilling because it seemed to remove the medium as a conscious filter. The hand was merely a vessel, the planchette a divinely guided instrument. It was a more intimate and personal form of communication than the public drama of a séance. From the planchette, it was a short, logical step to the talking board, which would later be patented and famously marketed as the Ouija board. These boards laid everything out for the spirits. The letters of the alphabet, the numbers 0 through 9, and the essential words yes, no, and goodbye. Now, the planchette could be used to spell out messages with much greater speed and clarity. The talking board became a fixture in many homes, a kind of spiritualist party game that could be brought out after dinner. It democratized spirit communication. You no longer needed to pay a professional medium. you and your friends could open a channel to the great beyond right there on your own dining room table. For believers, it was a profound tool for seeking guidance. For skeptics, it was a fascinating study in the ideomotor effect, the power of unconscious muscle movements. For everyone, it was undeniably spooky. For those who preferred their spiritual communication to be a bit more auditory, there was the spirit trumpet. This was typically a long, conical horn made of tin or aluminum, often with phosphorescent paint on its ends, so it could be seen floating in the darkened séance room. The trumpet would be placed in the center of the room, and the sitters would wait. Soon, faint whispers and voices would begin to emanate from its bell, supposedly the actual direct voices of the spirits, amplified by the cone. The sound was eerie and disembodied, and it was a powerful effect. Of course, the less scrupulous mediums would simply speak into the other end in a disguised voice, or use a hidden rubber hose. But for the faithful, hearing the distinct whispering voice of a lost loved one emerge from a floating trumpet was a deeply moving and convincing experience. Another common trick of the trade was slate writing. The medium would present 2 ordinary school slates, showing them to be blank. They might be washed and sealed together with wax or tied tightly with string. The sealed slates would be placed on the table in full view. After a few moments, a scratching sound would be heard from within. When the slates were opened, a message written in chalk would be found inside, a direct reply to a question that had been asked. This seemed to defy all logical explanation. How could anyone write on the inside of a sealed container? The methods were, in reality, quite clever, involving pre-written messages concealed with fine thread or tiny pieces of chalk known as billets, hidden under a fingernail or in the mouth and used with lightning-fast sleight of hand in a moment of distraction. But, like all good magic tricks, its apparent impossibility was its strength, providing yet another piece of irrefutable evidence for the believers. Chapter 10. The Ghost in the Machine. Of all the new technologies that the Victorians co-opted for their spiritual quest, none was more powerful, more evocative, or more easily manipulated than photography. This new, almost magical art form, which could capture a perfect, silent likeness of a person and fix it on a piece of glass or paper, already seemed to have 1 foot in the spirit world. A photograph was a kind of ghost in itself, a moment stolen from the relentless flow of time, a chemical memory of a person who was no longer there. It was only natural, then, that people began to wonder, if the camera could capture the ghost of a moment, could it also capture a real ghost? The answer, it seemed, was yes. In the 1860s, a new and controversial profession emerged, the spirit photographer. The most famous of these early practitioners was an American named William H. Mumler, who worked in Boston and later New York. Mumler discovered his strange talent by accident. When developing a self-portrait, he was startled to find a second, faint, translucent figure in the image, which he identified as a cousin who had died 12 years earlier. Realizing the potential, he went into business, offering to take portraits of ordinary people that might, just might, also feature the spectral image of a departed loved one. The process was shrouded in mystery and ritual. A client would sit for their portrait in Mumler's studio, concentrating their thoughts on the person they hoped to contact. Mumler would take the photograph. And when the glass plate was developed, a ghostly, ethereal figure would often be seen hovering behind the sitter, its form hazy and transparent. The emotional impact of these images was immense. For a grieving mother to see the faint, smiling face of her lost child seemingly looking over her shoulder was a profoundly moving experience. It was one thing to hear a rap on a table. It was another thing entirely to see the person you had lost. This was visual proof, something you could hold in your hands, frame, and place on your mantelpiece. Mumler's most famous client was undoubtedly Mary Todd Lincoln. Still deep in mourning for her assassinated husband several years after his death, the former First Lady visited Mumler's studio under an assumed name. The resulting photograph is one of the most iconic images of the era. It shows Mrs. Lincoln, clad in her widow's black, looking somberly at the camera, while behind her the tall, spectral form of Abraham Lincoln stands, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. For a nation still grieving its lost leader, and for a widow consumed by her personal loss, the photograph was a source of immense comfort and a powerful piece of spiritualist propaganda. Of course, the entire enterprise was based on photographic trickery. Spirit photographers were masters of the double exposure. They would have a collection of pre-made glass negatives featuring figures draped in sheets, and they would simply expose the photographic plate once with the sitter, and then again, very faintly, with one of their ghostly images. Other times, an assistant dressed as a ghost would briefly step into the frame during a long exposure, creating a blurry, transparent effect. It was a simple illusion, but photography was such a new and trusted medium that most people did not even consider the possibility of such sophisticated deception. The skeptics, particularly other photographers who understood the technical process, cried foul. Mumler was eventually put on trial for fraud in a sensational case that captivated the public. While he was ultimately acquitted, the prosecution couldn't definitively prove he had faked the Lincoln photograph, for instance. The trial exposed the methods of the trade and cast a long shadow of doubt over the practice. Yet, the desire to see the departed was so strong that spirit photography continued to flourish for decades. It was a perfect Victorian invention, a fusion of cutting-edge technology and deep-seated sentimental longing, a machine that promised to make ghosts visible and memories tangible. Chapter 11. The Celebrity Medium. As spiritualism grew from a parlor pastime into a full-blown cultural movement, its most successful practitioners were catapulted to a level of fame and notoriety that was entirely new. They were not just communicators with the dead, they were celebrities, rock stars of the supernatural world. These celebrity mediums toured the country and the continent, commanding huge fees, attracting legions of devoted followers, and generating endless columns of press coverage, both adoring and scathing. They were charismatic, controversial, and they pushed the boundaries of what a seance could be, transforming it from a quiet, somber affair into a spectacular, theatrical performance. Perhaps the most enigmatic and famous of them all was Daniel Douglas Home. A tall, handsome, and consumptive Scotsman, Home possessed an extraordinary charm and a flair for the dramatic that captivated the highest echelons of European society. Unlike most mediums who insisted on total darkness, Home often conducted his seances in the soft light of evening, allowing his sitters to witness the phenomena with their own eyes. And the phenomena were astonishing. Heavy tables would levitate several feet off the floor. An accordion, held in a cage beneath the table, would play beautiful melodies. Luminous, disembodied hands would appear, floating through the air to shake a sitter's hand or offer them a flower. Holmes' most legendary feat was his apparent ability to levitate. In a famous incident in 1868, witnessed by several respectable gentlemen, Holmes was said to have floated out of a third-story window in one room and back in through the window of an adjoining room, all while in a trance. The story became a cornerstone of spiritualist lore, a miracle that seemed to defy all rational explanation. What made Holmes so convincing was his demeanor. He was a gentleman, not a showman. He never took money for his seances, accepting only gifts or the hospitality of his wealthy patrons. And throughout his long career, despite intense scrutiny, he was never caught in any definitive act of fraud. The poet Robert Browning, however, remained unconvinced, and based his scathing satirical poem, Mr. Sludge, the Medium, on his experiences with Holmes, portraying him as a lecherous, manipulative charlatan. Another superstar of the seance room was Florence Cook, a young, pretty Londoner, who, in her teens, began to produce one of the most spectacular phenomena of all, full-form materialization. Cook would enter her spirit cabinet, a curtained-off corner of the room, and after a short time, the figure of a spirit named Katy King would emerge. Katy King claimed to be the spirit of a 17th-century Welsh buccaneer's daughter. She would walk among the sitters, talk to them, allow them to touch her, and even pose for photographs. The scientist Sir William Crookes conducted a lengthy, famous investigation of Florence Cook, becoming utterly convinced that Katy King was a genuine, otherworldly being, separate from the medium herself. The photographic plates he produced of the ghostly Katy, sometimes standing alongside a very human-looking Miss Cook, are some of the most bizarre and compelling artifacts of the era. Of course, skeptics pointed out that Katy King bore a striking resemblance to Florence Cook herself, and that a simple change of clothes and hairstyle in the privacy of the cabinet was the most likely explanation. Eventually, a fellow spiritualist, determined to expose what she saw as a fraud, grabbed hold of Katy King during a seance and found her to be all too solid. These mediums and others like them, the Davenport brothers with their miraculous spirit cabinet escapes, or Eusapia Palladino, the feisty Italian medium whose seances were a chaotic whirlwind of flying furniture, became household names. Their careers were a constant drama of miraculous manifestations, scientific investigations, bitter rivalries, and scandalous exposures. They were adored by their followers, who saw them as prophets of a new age, and reviled by their critics, who saw them as shameless predators preying on the vulnerable. But whatever one's opinion, they were undeniably the heart of the movement, the charismatic conduits who made the conversation with the dead a public, spectacular, and unforgettable drama. Chapter 12. Ectoplasm and Ether. As the Victorian era wore on and the public appetite for spiritualist phenomena grew, the manifestations themselves became increasingly physical. It was no longer enough to hear a rap or see a table tilt. Believers wanted more tangible, more visceral proof of the spirit world's existence. In response, a new and altogether stranger chapter in the history of spiritualism began to unfold, one centered on the production of a mysterious, semi-living substance that came to be known as ectoplasm. This was the messy, gooey, and deeply weird side of the seance, a development that pushed the movement to the very limits of credibility and, for many, well beyond. The term ectoplasm, coined by the French physiologist Charles Richet, referred to a viscous, ethereal substance that was said to issue from the body of a medium in a deep trance. It might emerge from the mouth, the nose, the ears, or even the solar plexus. In the dim light of the seance room, sitters would watch in horrified fascination as streams of a whitish, gauze-like material, sometimes filmy and light, sometimes thick and doughy, emanated from the medium. This substance, believers claimed, was the raw material of the spirit world, the physical building block that spirits use to form hands, faces, and even entire bodies. It was described as feeling cool and slightly moist to the touch, and it was said to have a distinctive smell, often compared to ozone. Flash photography from the era captured images of this supposed spirit stuff, and they are among the most grotesque and bizarre pictures you will ever see. They show mediums with long, stringy ropes of what looks like cheesecloth or papier-mâché dangling from their nostrils and mouths. Sometimes crude, mask-like faces appear within the folds of the ectoplasm, presented as the spirits themselves in the process of forming. It was a strange, biological form of sculpture, with the medium's body as the studio and the soul's supposed essence as the clay. Another related phenomenon was the apport, the apparent teleportation of objects into the sealed seance room. Suddenly, a flower might drop from the ceiling onto the table, still wet with dew, or a piece of fruit, a seashell, or an ancient-looking coin might materialize in a sitter's hand. These were presented as gifts from the spirit world, physical objects brought across the veil as proof of their power. The famous Italian medium Eusapia Palladino was known for producing apports, though she was also famous for being caught using her feet and clever contortions to move objects around the room. The most dramatic of these physical phenomena, as we've touched upon, was full-form materialization. A medium would enter a spirit cabinet, and a complete, solid-looking spirit figure would emerge. These materialized spirits were not always the ethereal, floating phantoms of popular imagination. They were often quite solid, able to walk, talk, and touch. Some mediums even staged spirit reunions, where multiple materialized figures would appear at once, allowing sitters to have extended, emotional conversations with what they believed to be their departed family members. For the modern observer, the fraud behind these physical manifestations seems glaringly obvious. The ectoplasm was almost always a mundane substance like muslin, cheesecloth, egg white, or even chewed-up paper, which the medium had swallowed or otherwise concealed on their person before the séance, only to regurgitate or extrude it at the opportune moment. The apported objects were simply hidden in their clothing. The materialized spirits were either the medium in a flimsy disguise or a hidden accomplice. But we must remember the context. These events took place in near total darkness. The sitters were in a state of high emotional arousal and intense expectation, and the desire to believe, to see and touch a lost loved one one last time, was a force powerful enough to overwhelm reason. This strange, physical, and often messy chapter of spiritualism reveals just how far people were willing to go, and how much they were willing to overlook in their search for a tangible connection to the world beyond. Chapter 13. The Unbelievers. For every séance that ended with a room full of weeping, grateful believers, There was a scientist, a magician, or a simple, hard-headed journalist convinced that the entire thing was a colossal fraud. The story of spiritualism is not just the story of belief. It is also the story of a dogged, relentless, and often ingenious opposition. The rise of the medium was shadowed at every turn by the rise of the investigator, and their cat-and-mouse game, played out in darkened parlors and public lecture halls, became one of the great intellectual dramas of the late Victorian age. From the very beginning, the scientific establishment was, for the most part, deeply skeptical. While a few prominent scientists, like Crookes and Wallace, were converted, the majority saw spiritualism as a dangerous resurgence of superstition that threatened the rational progress of the age. One of the earliest and most elegant debunkings was performed by the celebrated physicist Michael Faraday in the 1850s. To investigate the wildly popular phenomenon of table turning, he devised a simple but brilliant experiment. He placed several layers of cardboard on a table, held together by a little soft cement, so that they could slide over one another. A small indicator would show any movement. He discovered that the table always moved in the direction of the sitter's hands, and that the top layer of cardboard, moved by their hands, always moved before the table itself did. His conclusion was clear. The table wasn't being moved by spirits. It was being moved by the unconscious, involuntary muscle movements of the participants themselves. It was a psychological phenomenon, not a supernatural one. As the claims of mediums grew more elaborate, so too did the methods of the investigators. Skeptical committees were formed, most notably the Society for Psychical Research, founded in London in 1882. This was not a group of closed-minded debunkers. Its members, a mix of academics, scientists, and philosophers, were genuinely open to the possibility of paranormal phenomena, but they were committed to investigating it with the utmost scientific rigor. They spent years conducting painstaking research, sitting in on seances, interviewing mediums, and attempting to replicate the phenomena under controlled laboratory conditions. Their findings, published in lengthy, detailed reports, were overwhelmingly negative. Time and time again, they discovered that when a medium was properly searched and secured, and when the lighting conditions were improved, the spirits simply failed to show up. The investigators became experts in the arts of deception. They knew to check for hidden panels in spirit cabinets, to listen for the telltale snap of a cracking toe joint, and to look for fine black thread used to float trumpets and tambourines. They understood how mediums used accomplices planted in the audience to feed them information, and how they employed a technique we would now call cold reading, making a series of vague, high-probability guesses until one hits the mark, then elaborating on it as if it were a specific spirit message. I'm getting the name John. A father or grandfather figure, there was a problem with his chest. The press also played a crucial role in the skeptical counter-movement. While some papers sensationalized the spiritualists, many took great delight in exposing them. A journalist might attend a séance and, at a crucial moment, strike a match or use a hidden flashpan, illuminating the room to reveal the materialized spirit as nothing more than the medium in her nightgown, waving a piece of cheesecloth. These exposés were hugely popular, providing a satisfying dose of rational comeuppance to what many saw as a predatory industry. This constant battle between the mediums and the investigators created a fascinating arms race. As the investigators' methods became more sophisticated, the mediums' tricks had to become more clever. It was a high-stakes game of illusion and detection. Yet, for all the evidence of fraud, the movement persisted. The will to believe was a powerful thing. For every medium exposed as a charlatan, followers would argue that the spirits had simply abandoned them because of the hostile, skeptical atmosphere created by the investigators. The unbelievers could win the logical arguments, but for a very long time they struggled to win the hearts and minds of those who had found, in the darkened parlor, a comfort that reason could not provide. Chapter 14. The Magician's Crusade. While the Victorian era was the high point of the spiritualist craze, the final, most dramatic act in the war between belief and skepticism was played out in the early 20th century. And its leading man was not a scientist, but the greatest illusionist and escape artist of his time, Harry Houdini. Houdini's relationship with spiritualism was deeply personal and intensely passionate. He was not a cold, detached debunker. He was a grieving son, a man who desperately wanted to believe. And it was this frustrated hope that fueled his famous crusade against fraudulent mediums. Houdini's beloved mother, Cecilia, died in 1913, and he was devastated. The two had been exceptionally close, and he longed for a way to make contact with her one last time. He turned to the world of spiritualism, not as a skeptic, but as a hopeful seeker. He attended séance after séance, offering large sums of money to any medium who could provide a single, genuine message from his mother. He promised them he was the easiest man in the world to fool, as he so wanted it to be true. But his expertise in the arts of deception was also his curse. As a master of tricks, illusions, and misdirection, he saw through the crude methods of the mediums instantly. He saw the hidden wires, the trap doors, the sleight of hand. Where others saw miracles, he saw only tradecraft, and poor tradecraft at that. His search for genuine contact turned into a bitter disappointment, and that disappointment curdled into a righteous anger. He felt that these fraudulent mediums were not just performers, they were vultures, preying on the raw, open wounds of the bereaved, offering false hope for profit. His personal quest for his mother transformed into a public crusade to expose every fraudulent medium he could find. He became the world's most famous ghost hunter, and his methods were pure theater. Houdini would travel with a team of assistants, often attending séances in disguise, wearing a false beard or pretending to be a simple, easily impressed old man. He would watch the medium's performance carefully, identifying their methods. Then, at the most dramatic moment, just as the spirit trumpet began to whisper, or the ghostly form began to materialize, Houdini would leap up, turn on the lights, and physically restrain the medium, revealing their secrets to the stunned audience. He would show them the hidden trumpets, the luminous paint on the medium's fingers, the cheesecloth she was preparing to disgorge as ectoplasm. He would then often replicate the medium's miracles himself, showing how they were achieved through natural, albeit skillful means. His crusade brought him into direct and public conflict with one of the most prominent spiritualists of the age. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of the hyper-rational detective Sherlock Holmes. Doyle, whose son had died in the First World War, was a passionate and utterly sincere believer in spiritualism. He and Houdini began as friends, united by a mutual fascination with the subject. Doyle was convinced that Houdini's own amazing escapes were the result of genuine psychic powers, a claim that Houdini, the master of self-promotion, found both amusing and frustrating. Their friendship eventually fractured and turned into a bitter public feud, waged in the newspapers and lecture halls. Doyle accused Houdini of being a powerful medium who was using his gifts to deny the very existence of the spirit world. Houdini, in turn, saw Doyle as a brilliant man who had been tragically duped by his own grief and wishful thinking. This clash of two titans, the great storyteller who had lost his faith in reason, and the great illusionist who had lost his hope for a miracle, symbolized the final, exhausted phase of the spiritualist debate. Houdini, before his death in 1926, arranged a secret code with his wife, Bess. He promised that if it were at all possible, he would contact her from beyond the grave and deliver the code. For 10 years after his death, Bess held a seance every Halloween, waiting for the message. It never came. Finally, in 1936, she gave up, famously declaring that 10 years is long enough to wait for any man. The great escape artist had found one lock he could not pick. Chapter 15. The Long Goodbye. Like the slow guttering flame of a candle at the end of a long night, the great Victorian obsession with spiritualism did not go out all at once, but slowly faded. By the turn of the 20th century, the cultural energy that had fueled the movement for half a century was beginning to dissipate. The whispers from the other side were growing fainter, not because the spirits had fallen silent, but because the living were gradually becoming less inclined to listen. The world was changing, and the seance room, once a theater of thrilling and profound possibility, was starting to look a little dusty and old-fashioned. The relentless campaign of exposure by skeptics and magicians like Houdini had undeniably taken its toll. The constant stream of newspaper articles gleefully revealing the tricks of the trade, the cheesecloth ectoplasm, the joint-cracking raps, the hidden assistants, had created a cumulative effect. While devoted believers remained unshaken, the wider public grew more cynical. The movement acquired a persistent, slightly shabby reputation for fraud and credulity. It began to seem less like a scientific inquiry and more like a sad, elaborate magic show for the emotionally vulnerable. Life itself was also becoming less deadly. The late Victorian and Edwardian period saw enormous advances in public health, sanitation, and medicine. Sewers were built, water supplies were cleaned up, and the new germ theory of disease led to antiseptic practices and the eventual development of vaccines and treatments for diseases that had once been death sentences. People, particularly children, were simply not dying at the same terrifying rate. As the immediate, everyday presence of death receded, so too did the desperate, urgent need to deny its finality. The elaborate rituals of Victorian mourning began to seem morbid and excessive to a new, more forward-looking generation. And then came the cataclysm of the First World War. This unprecedented slaughter might have been expected to trigger a massive revival of spiritualism, and for a short time it did. A new generation of bereaved parents, wives, and siblings flocked to mediums, desperate for any word from the millions of young men lost in the trenches. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's passionate advocacy, for instance, was driven by the loss of his son in the war. But the sheer, overwhelming scale of the loss also had a numbing effect. The gentle, sentimental melancholy of the Victorian seance seemed inadequate, almost naive in the face of such industrial-scale carnage. The world had become a harder, more cynical place. Furthermore, a new science was emerging that offered a different way to understand the mysteries of the human mind: psychoanalysis. The theories of Sigmund Freud and his followers provided a new language for talking about grief, desire, memory, and the unconscious. A vivid dream of a dead loved one was no longer necessarily a spiritual visitation. It could be interpreted as a manifestation of unresolved grief or wish fulfillment. The strange compulsions and pronouncements of a medium in a trance could be seen not as spirit possession, but as a form of hysteria or disassociation. Psychology offered a rational, scientific, and entirely earthly explanation for many of the phenomena that had once seemed supernatural. Spiritualism did not vanish. It continued, as it does to this day, as a formal religion and a private belief for many. But its moment as a mainstream cultural obsession was over. It retreated from the drawing rooms of the intellectually curious and became a more fringe interest. The long, strange, candlelit conversation with the dead that had captivated a generation had finally wound down. Looking back, we can see the Victorian obsession with talking to the dead not as a moment of collective madness, but as a profoundly human response to a world of bewildering change. It was an attempt to find a foothold in a landscape where the old anchors of faith were dragging, and the new landscapes of science were both thrilling and terrifying. It was a movement born of grief, shaped by technology, and sustained by the timeless, desperate, and deeply human hope that the people we love are not gone forever, but are merely waiting for us, listening from a room just next door.